from the actual site of an Iron Dome battery is Lieutenant Colonel Jonathan Conricus. He's international spokesperson for the IDF. Lieutenant Colonel, thanks so much for joining the program. Really appreciate the time.
Thank you, Ben. Thanks for having me.
So let's talk about, for a second, the efficacy of Iron Dome. So I see behind you, it looks like you have a battery for Iron Dome. How does Iron Dome work for people who don't even understand, what the technology does?
Think of a magic sphere protecting civilians. You see the pod behind me? That's a pod of interceptors. Each interceptor costs nearly $100,000. And one interceptor intercepts one rocket. Now, Hamas has fired more than 4,000 rockets at Israel, and the interception rate is 90%. And unfortunately, as I said, we've had 12 civilians in Israel killed. But other than that, the Iron Dome has been performing outstandingly. Simply amazing. It provides that strategic flexibility for Israel. We're lowering the amount of casualties in Israel. I wouldn't want to imagine, not in terms of Israel, and certainly not in terms of Gaza and other Palestinians, what the situation would be like if we didn't have the Iron Dome. It's absolutely strategic. It's the first of its kind in the world, a combat-proven system, just 10 years old, that is able to intercept everything from a small rocket, a mortar, to a big 10, 15, 20 feet rocket. So it's very versatile, and for the first time, we've also intercepted a fixed-wing drone, an explosive kamikaze drone that Hamas tried to dispatch at one of our cities. We intercepted it with the Iron Dome, which is the first time. Worth mentioning, this system is Israeli and US made. There's Israeli and American brain power in this. It's the child of the cooperation between Israel and the US. And I'm happy to say that today it's used by Israeli and US armed forces. And I think that's amazing that US has this technology using it as well. I hope that the US will never need to use it to defend their civilians or their troops. But I can assure you that it's an outstanding system.
So the theory has been going that Hamas here was basically attempting to overwhelm Iron Dome with the sheer number of rockets that were being fired, and that while Iron Dome was stopping 90%, that means 10% are either falling in unpopulated areas or getting through, and that this is more of a preparation by Hamas for the possibility that Hezbollah from the north, which has something like 150,000 rockets ready, would attempt to overwhelm Iron Dome in sheer numbers. How much of a threat is that?
So you're spot on. The issue here is quantity. So far, in 12 days of fighting and 4,000 rockets fired, the system has performed excellently. And it has not been overwhelmed. It has delivered. It is the average interception rate is on par with its previous interception rate in regular times. So the system is definitely scaling up. We've added battalions, we've added interceptors, we've enhanced our logistic capabilities of reloading these pods behind me because they fire at a very high rate. There are some batteries down south in southern Israel which have been replenishing their ammunition 20 times a day, 20 pods a day, like this. In terms of the rockets that are fired, for instance, in Ashkelon, that city has sustained about 500 rockets per day for 12 days straight. Think of those figures. It's unimaginable figures. Imagine what it feels like to be a civilian living under such kind of threats. And I don't want to imagine how it will without the Iron Dome. But yes, the threat in terms of the north is a very grave one, much bigger than what we're facing from Hamas in the south. Hezbollah is really a terror army with more firepower than many European militaries have today. And that's amazing when you think of it. A Levantine militia that has a country holding a nation state hostage for its purposes has more firepower than many European countries, and that's a threat. The problem is that the world and the international community doesn't understand that if there are more casualties in Israel, the IDF will have to respond much stronger against the areas that from where we're being fired upon. We won't have the ability to be nice and only do precision strikes. No. If there will be sustained rocket fire at our civilians, overwhelming our defensive systems, the only answer will be significant use of firepower against the sources of fire, and that will be a totally different situation for Lebanon. So we sure hope that Hassan Nasrallah is watching, learning, paying attention to what's happening, and paying attention to the combat capabilities of the Air Force, and draws his own relevant conclusions from this.
So, final question for you, Lieutenant Colonel. the media has refused to cover in detail the sorts of human rights violations that Hamas has been carrying out, aside from simply firing rockets into civilian areas. There was an attack in the last couple of days on an aid thoroughfare. There was an aid thoroughfare that was opened by Israel. Israel was attempting to ship in human aid to Gaza, and Hamas attacked the thoroughfare. Hamas has been engaged in regular human rights violations throughout this campaign, including hiding, obviously, military resources in places like the same building that was occupied by the Associated Press. Maybe you can talk a little bit about what we know about Hamas's human rights violations.
Yeah. You know what I'd like to say about that is that I'm simply astounded by the lack of effort of international media in documenting and honestly reporting what Hamas is doing on ground and underground in Gaza. They're simply giving them a pass, and you won't see any pictures from any of the agencies, any of the big networks and papers of what Hamas is doing inside. To date, I haven't seen one single image of a rocket being fired from a house or from close to a house in Gaza, and that happens dozens of times a day, sometimes even more than that, and not even one single picture. We've sent those pictures out, live videos of rocket launches that are nested just inside a house courtyard, close to schools, mosques, hospitals, everything. And there's zero documentation of that. There's zero reporting of that. There's zero reporting of any armed personnel. You haven't seen a single Hamas operative in uniform in any of the networks. And I think it's just an atrocity. There's so much scrutiny and criticism of Israel. That's fine. Scrutiny is good. It makes sure that everything is okay. But how about looking at what the terrorist organization on the other side does against Israel? And why isn't that being documented? And where's the global outcry as to the purpose, the violations done by them?
Well, it continues to be an astonishing fact that Israel does its best to prevent civilian casualties while defending its citizens, and yet the world all too often seems to be willing to slip into a moral equivalence that's utterly unjustifiable on the ground by the facts. Lieutenant Colonel Conricus, really appreciate the time and appreciate what you're doing.
Thank you very much, Ben. Have a good day.
Salutare, sunt Ovidiu Petric și dacă ți-a plăcut materialul acesta și ți-a fost de folos, te încurajez să te abonezi pe canalul meu și haide să distribuim adevărul în public. De ce? Fiindcă doar adevărul ne va face liberi. Rămâi cu bine!